Hi everyone. Today we're going to discuss how to cut out the marker for your sewing notebook. Your sewing notebook will be a collection of sewing technique samples that we'll create and group into a binder that you use as a reference throughout your classes. To cut out the pieces for our sewing notebook, we're going to be using a tool called a marker. A marker is basically a layout of all the pattern pieces required to create a garment that not only ensures there is minimum fabric waste, but also it helps to place all the pieces on the correct grain of the fabric so that you get a well-hanging garment in the end. You should all have been given 2 different markers in your toolkit for this class. One of them will be for a shirt that we'll create later on in the quarter, but we're only going to be cutting out the one for the sewing notebook today. So you're going to want to look for the one with lots of smaller pieces on it. That's the one for the notebook. For our cutting process, you will need your marker, your fabric shears, stapler, pins, an awl, and a tape measure, in addition to some dotted pattern paper and muslin fabric. You'll also want to be sure that you have a nice, smooth, hard cutting surface. If you don't have a large enough cutting table, of course, dining room table works. If you must use the floor, then be sure that it's only a hard floor and not a carpet. This process does not go so well on carpet, so make sure you have a smooth, hard surface to do your cutting on. We're going to be creating a stack of 4 separate layers that will consist of your marker on top, 2 layers of muslin, and then finally a base layer of paper that will help stabilize the fabric as we're cutting it. If you're working on a table that's large enough for the whole marker to fit across, then you can just create one of these stacks. But if your cutting table space is a little bit more limited, then you can actually cut your marker in half on a line that I will show you, and then you'll be able to create 2 smaller stacks that'll be a little bit easier to manipulate in a smaller space. First off, you'll want to take your marker and unfold it. As you can see, there's going to be a lot of deep creases left on the paper from it being folded. So one of the first things you'll want to do as you're unfolding is try to correct some of those creases a little bit to help the marker sit a little more smoothly on the fabric as we're cutting. So you can do that by looking for one of the folds here and simply creasing the paper backwards to sort of reverse the fold, kind of folding it in the opposite direction that the crease was. So go through to any of these creases and just run your finger along them and fold the paper backwards to try to smooth them out as much as possible before we continue. Once you've smoothed out your marker a bit, the next thing we want to do is measure the overall length of the marker. This is what's going to tell us how long our fabric pieces need to be cut. So you'll want to measure the length along not the short side, which is the width, but instead look for the long edge. There should also be a little sort of long skinny rectangle along the edge marked as selvage, which we'll discuss in a minute. That's the direction in which you want to take your measurement of the length. So just take your tape measure and you're going to measure the full length of the marker. If you have a 60-inch tape measure, your marker is longer than that, so you'll just want to continue the measurement. I'm getting about 73 inches for the overall length. So from that 73-inch measurement, you'll probably want to add a couple inches just as sort of breathing room. So let's just call it 75 inches overall. That means we want to cut 2 pieces of our muslin that are also 75 inches in length. Or if you have the space limitations that we kind of discussed earlier and you want to do this as 2 separate stacks, then come to the middle of your marker right here, and there is one solid line that cuts all the way through that is not a part of the border of any of these other pieces. So right here, you can take your paper scissors and cut right on that line to separate your marker into 2 halves. Then you would take the measurement for each one individually and cut 2 pieces of muslin large enough for this half and 2 pieces of muslin large enough for this half. But for the sake of our demonstration, I'm going to be keeping it all as one piece for the time being. So I'm going to go with our 75-inch measurement. Again, that's sort of the length of the marker plus just a couple inches of extra. When you unroll your muslin fabric at the beginning, you're going to have two different sides. You will see that there's one edge across the width of the roll in which the fabric has either been torn or cut by a pair of scissors. And then on the opposing side, on both ends, you will see this long edge that looks more like a finished edge. The weave looks a little bit different than the rest of the fabric. We call these edges, these finished edges, the selvages. So you are going to measure the length of your muslin along the selvage. So you want to start with your measuring tape at the beginning and measure down the length of the selvage 75 inches. Just like when we measured the marker, you'll see that the measuring tape ends at 60. So I want to hold my position on the fabric at 60 inches and add another 15 to be at my 75-inch measurement. Okay, so right here, there's my 75 inches. And what we're going to do is, rather than cutting the fabric all the way across, you're going to take your fabric shears and just do a little snip deep enough to get past the selvage. On a woven fabric, you're actually able to tear the fabric all the way across once you get it started, and it should follow one of your weft yarns all the way across. So you want to grasp it firmly and pull. Don't try to tear the whole thing in one go though, because you want to have your hands close to where you're tearing. So do it in small sections. And you'll repeat this process to tear off another 75-inch piece. We want 2 layers of fabric that are 75 inches long. After your 2 pieces of muslin have been cut, now we want to cut a piece of your dotted pattern paper that's the same 75-inch length measurement. So you'll take your measuring tape as you unroll your paper and measure the same 75-inch length piece down the length of your paper. And when you get to that measurement, you'll simply want to use your scissors and cut, following one of the rows of numbers as you go all the way across the width of the paper. Your dotted paper is going to serve as the base layer of this stack that we're creating. So you want to have that laid out first on the very bottom. Next, we'll be grabbing both layers of our fabric and laying them on top. And our goal in doing all this as we create our stack of paper and fabric is to be lining up the selvages of all of them on the edge facing you. So we'll consider this to be the selvage of my paper, and as I bring over my 2 layers of fabric, I will also want to perfectly align the selvage with this edge of the paper. Something you may want to do that will help you out as we lay our fabric over the top of our paper is to tape down the corners at either end. Just a little piece of tape to secure it, otherwise the paper will be sliding all around as we're trying to lay our fabric on top. So I'm going to go ahead and do that first. Now we're going to go ahead and bring in our first layer of muslin and lay it right over the top, aligning the selvage with the edge of the paper. Okay, so just want to pull it into place, and we're looking at this right here, selvage matched to paper. As you get them lined up, you'll want to be smoothing out your fabric as much as possible. So not just along the length, but also across the width. You want everything nice and smooth with no bubbles or folds between your layers. After our first layer is nicely lined up, then you're going to go ahead and grab your second piece of muslin and lay it over the top in the same manner. What's helpful at this point too, when you have the 2 layers of muslin, is to actually use any sort of weight that you have to weigh it down at the edge here as you smooth across. For weights, you can use actual pattern weights, but if you don't have them, then anything heavy will do. textbook is nice. Anything to just kind of hold the edges in place as we smooth away from them. After your second layer of muslin has been nicely smoothed out, the final layer of our stack is going to be to place our marker right over the top of everything. The marker itself also has an edge that is labeled as the selvage. So you'll want to match that labeled selvage edge with the selvages of your fabric as you place your marker on top of everything. So I'm going to remove the weights. Lay my marker right on top. And I want to look at this edge here. See, there it is, that little selvage indicator. I want to have that edge of the paper perfectly aligned with my fabric selvages as I place it on top. Let's weigh it down for a moment as well. And just smooth out your marker as much as possible. For the next part of our cutting process, we're going to be securing the layers of paper and fabric together through a series of both stapling as well as pinning. We'll be applying staples in sort of the negative space areas of our marker, and then the pins will go within the actual pattern piece boundaries. So given that, take a look at what's going on our marker. You want to sort of observe the shapes that we have happening here. This one, for instance, you could see that this outer line here is the outer boundary of the pattern piece. Same over here. You'll also have a series of rectangles, and those actually have shared lines. The rectangles even share a cutting line with this piece right here for your curved seam. So take note of what areas are considered negative space, which would be this area in between pattern pieces, and which parts are the pieces themselves. Once you've kind of observed that, now we can go ahead and do our stapling process. And the staples will sit only within the negative spaces of our pieces. You don't want to do any stapling within an actual pattern piece because the staples could sort of damage the fabric a bit. We're going to begin our stapling process along our selvage edge right here. We'll begin in the middle and work our way outwards, smoothing as we go. But before we do that, since we're going to be stapling through all the layers, we want to remove those couple pieces of tape that we used at the beginning to secure our base layer of paper. Otherwise, we won't really be able to lift everything enough to apply our staples. So untape any bits that you have that are holding the paper down to the table, as well as move any weights out of the way. Be sure that your stack stays nicely lined up. And then right here in the middle of your selvage, you'll want to carefully lift up all the layers and staple right in the selvage area. From here, we're going to spread outwards and continue stapling. Maybe every 6 inches or so is good. So I'll work over a little bit right here, carefully lift, and staple, and continue. And be sure that you're keeping everything nice and smooth and all your layers are even. You want to make sure that the paper and the fabric stays evenly distributed the whole way down. So, did that side. Now I'll work my way out in the other direction. Because of the paper that we have as the very bottom layer, everything should be secure enough for you to carefully slide it down. After the stapling has been completed along the selvage edge, next, if you kept your marker intact as one rectangle and didn't divide this into 2 sections, then we're going to go ahead and cut on that halfway line anyways. So look for right in the middle of your marker, you'll see this one solid line that's not a part of any piece. And you'll just want to cut right across to separate our marker into 2 workable sections. And you can do kind of a rough cut here. This isn't an edge of a pattern piece, so we're just separating things. So once we've done that, I can even take one section and set it aside and come back to it. Now that we've cut all the way across to separate into 2 halves, I can continue stapling along the negative space on this new edge of our stack of pieces. So smooth up and over from where you already have your staples on the selvage, and then continue stapling along the edge, but not in a piece. Remember to avoid them. When you come to the side opposite from where we began, you may notice that your fabric as well as the dotted paper underneath are wider than the marker. So what you'll want to do at that point is roughly cut that excess away so that we'll be able to come in with the stapler along the edge of that side. I'm just going to rotate it in this direction. Cutting is always best done away from you rather than towards or at an odd angle. So since our layers are already somewhat secure, feel free to rotate it as necessary to be at a more comfortable cutting angle. So now that this side has been cut closer to the pieces, we can come in and add more staples along that side. And then finally, staple across the 4th side of our stack. Once you're finished stapling around all 4 sides of your stack, we're going to continue to subdivide our pieces into rough sections and add more staples to the negative space. So observe the negative space between each individual piece, and you want to come in and roughly cut around chunks and sections to divide it into groups of 1 to 3 pieces each. So I can maybe come right through here, roughly cut there. So I'm just kind of keeping these 2 together. Once you have a little section, now we have more exposed perimeter of negative space, and we could add more staples to secure all these little mini stacks. So continue to smooth over from wherever you already have your staples, just in case you did catch any bubbles as you were laying out the layers. This is your chance to fix them and re-smooth anything. Still only stapling in the negative space. Okay, then we could set this aside, and you're going to continue to work your way through doing the same thing of subdividing into rough groupings of pieces and stapling in the negative area. But this one right here, before I even cut it away, I can staple the new exposed boundaries that I have. For this portion of the marker that contains all these series of rectangles, as well as 2 more pieces that are labeled curved seam, they're all kind of grouped together and sharing cut lines. So staple around the edge of this giant chunk as much as you can, but as far as all the spaces in between here, we're going to resolve that with pinning once we get to it. After you've completed breaking the first section of your marker into multiple small groups, you're going to repeat the same process for the second half of your marker. So first you'll staple around the perimeter, and then you'll come back and kind of chop it up and subdivide it into smaller sections and staple around those as well. This section right here that contains multiple kind of diagonal looking strips that we call the bias, you're going to treat this similarly to the rectangle section that we discussed earlier. So staple around that whole block of pieces, but then we'll be coming in with more pins in between to stabilize each individual section. After all of your pieces have been sufficiently stapled in the negative space, now we're going to go in and just apply a few pins to the interior border of each piece. That's what's going to help keep those layers together after we cut all the excess away. And the pins are a little bit less destructive to the fabric than the staples are. So you grab each section one at a time and just kind of look at each individual piece within your sections there. So if I'm looking at this one right here, I want to say, these are pretty small pieces. Probably anywhere from 2 to 4 pins per piece will be sufficient. So maybe down here I'll put a pin, and make sure you pin underneath all of your layers and bring that pin back up through. Also, place your pins not too close to the actual cutting line of each piece. Having a pin next to the cutting line causes the fabric to sort of wave up and down, and you may end up with a wavy, wonky cut line. So don't have them right next to the cutting line, but spaced in a ways. So I'll put maybe one down there and one over here. Down and up through everything, and then maybe one right about here. So that's probably enough pins for that piece. Move on to this one. So if it's kind of rectangular, then I would say maybe around your sort of corners are good. You could kind of point them in diagonally. Ultimately, the goal with the pins is to just not distort the cutting line if you can help it. So you're going to want to continue this process on all the other smaller groupings of pieces. When it's time for you to pin the larger section that has all the individual rectangles that share cutting lines, we want to kind of reinforce around the cut lines with pins, but look at these intersections right here where it's 4 pieces all coming together. If we had 4 pins, one on each corner there, it would just cause kind of a big wrinkly mess in that cutting area. So we do want to secure the corners, but not necessarily all of them. A good way to kind of space out your pins for this would be to look at each individual rectangle and pin bottom left corner and upper right. Bottom left, upper right. That kind of staggers them just enough to hold your piece steady, but without overly distorting it. So bottom left, upper right, bottom left, upper right, so you can already see here where there's all 4 of those pieces coming together. Everything will be nicely held in place for us, but it's not pin overload. Also, when you're applying these pins, a thing to always keep in mind, we talked about not having the pins too close to the cutting line just for the sake of not dimpling the fabric, but you especially don't want to have any part of the pin hanging over your cutting line. You don't want to come across a pin with your fabric shears, so make sure that they're always spaced away from the cutting lines for that reason as well. When you get to your diagonal bias strip section right here, you'll also want to be sure that each individual strip has its own set of pins, but that those pins aren't conflicting with the ones of the opposing piece. So you want to just sort of stagger them a bit and make sure there's a few on each strip. After you've thoroughly pinned each piece, it's going to be time to finally cut them out. We'll be using your fabric shears and going around the perimeter of every piece, cutting it as accurately as we can exactly on that line. But first off, we gotta go over some rules of using your fabric shears and just cutting tips in general. Rule number 1, your thumb goes in the small hole and your fingers go in the larger hole. Not just for the sake of comfort, but it actually affects how the shears work. Your fabric shears are meant to be used while cutting on a surface. So that's another rule that we'll, really emphasize in a moment, is that you never want to air cut. You're always cutting with the shears resting. So the reason that we need to have our hands in this position is that allows the blade of the shears to not lift up very much as we're cutting on a surface. But notice how if I had them in the opposite direction with the smaller hole on the bottom, look at how wide they swing open. That really affects the overall accuracy of your cut. So that's why it's especially important to always hold them in this particular way in your hand, with the thumb in the smaller hole. Next rule of cutting, as we kind of briefly mentioned, is no air cutting allowed. Meaning, you never want to lift up your paper and your fabric as you're cutting. For one, your muscles can't really operate accurately enough, but the bigger reason, particularly in a situation like this where we have multiple layers of fabric and paper, is lifting them up as we cut sometimes causes all those layers to shift around and detach from one another in a way that we're not cutting all of them in the same place at the same time. So cutting with everything as flat as possible and your shears resting on your cutting surface is always the best and most accurate way. Always make sure that you take smooth, long strokes with the shears as much as possible. And if you're continuing to cut on a long line, be sure that you bring the shears all the way forward into the previous cut line before you come down again. If you don't put your shears all the way forward into that previous cut, you're gonna end up with a jagged, ziggity-zaggedy cut line. So if you notice that happening, be sure that you're really extending them forward as you continue to cut. Lastly, of course, is just you wanna be cutting as accurately as possible, exactly on the line that is marked on your pattern. So something that also helps with that when we have multiple layers of fabric is being sure that your shears are placed perpendicular to the surface and they're not tilted to one side or the other. Keep them nice and straight and upright. Always cut away from your body. Never try to turn like this and cut them towards you. With small pieces like this that are nicely secured with pins and staples, the better technique is to actually rotate your fabric as you're cutting into the shears, rather than trying to take your shears and follow the cut line or chase the cut line. So, with all that said, here we go. I'm gonna look at my first piece right here, and we're just gonna go right in. Be sure to avoid any staples. You do not want your shears going over any staples and pins. It will create a skip in the blade that will cause them to not cut well. So, I'm gonna come right in here and look exactly on my line. You can use your other hand to kind of hold everything flat and make a nice smooth cut away. And you could sort of chop across and remove the scraps as you go. But as I continue, here's a nice little curve. So I want to get it started, and I'm holding my paper and fabric and turning them into my shears as I cut. Boom. Next line. And again, my shears are resting on the table the whole time. Nice. Right here, if I want, we have this cutaway dart that jumps upward, but just to keep my motion smooth, I can kind of continue straight across to the next portion if I want to, and then come back to that cutaway dart when I can rotate it towards myself to be at a better angle. So come right up to here, and if you have a certain point like this where you need to stop exactly at an exact point, have the tip of your shears positioned right at that spot so you can come down completely and stop nice and accurately at that point. Okay. Next little curve here. rotating my fabric, not my shears. And we're done. One down, 1,000 more to go. So continue cutting out all the pieces in your marker employing these techniques. And after we finish cutting, we'll have a series of markings that we need to learn and apply to our pieces as well. After you've gone through and finished all of your cutting, we'll also have to sort of scan over all of our pieces and look for any further markings that need to be made on them. We have two types of markings that we're going to be looking out for. One of them are notches, and the other one are drill holes, also called punch holes sometimes. Notches always occur at the outer edge of a pattern piece. So in the case of our midriff piece right here, a notch is indicated by this tiny little straight line drawn in from the edge of the piece. It appears a little bit differently on the piece called the release tuck right here. See how it looks like a little capital letter T? But ultimately, these are all indicators of notches. Notches are there when we're sewing to basically show us which piece gets matched up to what. It helps our fabric stay evenly distributed along a seam, tells us what the seam allowance is, and even labels parts of the piece, like whether it's front versus back. So to mark a notch on the piece, you're just going to use your fabric shears, find the little marking for the notch, and clip through the fabric and the paper exactly the depth of the marking, but not any further. So we're just going to lift it up, make sure I'm cutting through everything, and with the tip of your shears, just do a tiny little snip, and then you move on to the next one. Snip, snip, snip. And then in the case of the ones on the release tuck, it's the same process, but again, they're indicated by this little letter T, so just snip on the short leg of it. Snip, snip. You're going to want to go through all of your pieces and check for any of those notches and clip them after you've cut the pieces out. On the series of rectangles that we have, you won't see any on the primary ones that are labeled numbers 1 through 7, but on the rectangles that are labeled as being for the zipper, they do have notches. So ultimately, just look through with your best eagle eyes and find which pieces have notches. Some of them do, some of them don't. Make sure you clip all of them. The other type of marking that we have occurring throughout our pieces is called a drill hole or a punch hole. On different types of patterns, it can be indicated a little bit differently, but on this particular digitized pattern, it's indicated by this symbol right here. It looks like a little circle with a cross in the middle, or a plus sign. So when it's indicated like this, the center of the plus sign, where the two lines intersect, that's the exact point that we're going to be marking. And we're going to mark it using this tool called the awl. The awl has a super, super sharp tip, and what you do is take the awl, push it straight through the center of the plus sign, and while holding the awl down, you're gonna reach underneath and lift your fabric and paper upward onto the awl so that the tip of the awl is pushing through everything to the back side. What this basically does in the fabric is it causes the yarns to sort of separate and leave a temporary hole in the fabric that serves as an important mark when sewing. Drill holes or punch holes are usually used to mark anything that occurs inside the pattern piece as opposed to on the outer border. So they're most commonly used to show where the tip of a dart is, where a pocket placement is, as well as buttons or buttonholes. So You're going to want to look through all of your pattern pieces, and wherever you see any of the little drill hole markings, take your awl, go right through the center, push everything up onto the awl until it gets a little firm and hard to push through, and then you remove it, and it'll leave that temporary little hole in your pieces. After you've finished cutting all pattern pieces, the final step is to group them into bundles based on which samples we will be completing each week. Find the number and name printed on each piece and group them according to the following schedule. Your bundles can be either secured in bags or neatly tied together using strips torn from your fabric scraps. And now we're all good to go. Once everything has been cut and labeled and bundled by week, we'll be ready to start sewing next time.